Hi all. I thought I should show you another Fischer game in the curious interpretation of the Vienna game, which Fischer seemed to use in simultaneous displays. This was a Simul in 1964 in New York. So Fischer was playing white against Stephen Morrison. So let's have a look at this. E4, E5. We have bishop C4. This is one route into the Vienna game. Knight F6, Knight C3. So we have that Vienna move now. Knight C6, and now F4. So this is a very interesting kind of gambit, actually, basically, because after Knight takes E4, Black did actually test Fischer with Knight takes E4, which I thought was interesting. Because if you look at this with computers nowadays, it looks as though Black's fully equalized already. Now I should really explain why Knight takes E4 isn't that good here. If Knight takes E4, Black has a very powerful response in D5, and however White plays this, Black gets a really comfortable game. For example, Bishop D3, D takes, and then Bishop C5. This diagonal is pretty compromised. Black's got a good control over D4. White can't even castle that easily. There's an immediate disaster with F takes, with Queen H4 check, picking up the bishop. Yeah, this is just a really grim position to have with White. If we look at this again, so if Bishop takes D5, Queen takes, that's just improving Black's development. Black can get a magnificent position even like this, with Bishop takes E4 now being a threat on, so that Bishop can't really be taken. If Queen E2, Black's getting a fine position like this. Absolutely brilliant for Black. Knight G5 is an alternative, just taking on C4, and Queen D5 is strong. F6 and just double the pawns here. It's a wreck for White. So that's why Knight takes E4 is not very good at all. White has to play this now as a gambit with Knight F3. Fischer makes it into a gambit with Knight F3, and apparently, according to Chess Tempo at least, there's some evidence that this is called the Vienna game, the Stanley variation, Bronstein Gambit. Now, David Bronstein, very, very creative player, he had gambits in all sorts of openings. And in fact, he even mentioned Knight E2 on move 2. If you want a really surprising way to get into Vienna game, you could play Knight G-E2 on move 2 and Knight C3 later with G3 for a quiet Vienna. So he introduced all sorts of very interesting ideas. This gambit here doesn't seem entirely convincing, but let's have a look. Knight takes C3, D takes C3. So for the pawn here, what has White got? Well, White has double pawns. White has potential F file pressure, E file pressure, and D file pressure. So that's not bad. That's an interesting upside. There's a lot of piece activity potential here. We have Bishop E7. This isn't the critical test, according to engines. Making use of the loose piece and this diagonal is the key thing to do here. So the key move, it seems, would be Queen E7. The funny thing about this, even though this looks as though White's just a pawn down for nothing. So just to recap, if White castles, then there's Queen C5 check, end of game. But there's a couple of quite high level games in ChessBase Livebook with Queen E2, and believe it or not, White managed to draw both. So there's one example, Egin 2470 playing against Mozoin, a 2-3-5-5, which ended in a draw in this line. White's played Bishop E2, protecting that bishop. So Black has a bit of congestion charge to have to, now to castle kingside is a bit more hassle. But say D6, this is one of the stem games, and it seems as though it's not entirely easy for Black, as evidenced by this stem game, to convert this. In fact, we had a repetition draw by both of them. So yeah, unusual territory there. So that was one high-level game. And there's also another high-level game, so it's not all that bad, it seems, in practice. With E takes F4, this position, you might think, well, isn't Black just a pawn down here? White has a certain amount of compensation. And in that game, played Knight G5, not Rook 8 E1. And that was Sprangenberg 2305. against Lipak, a 2-4-30, Multiplatter 1992, and that ended in a draw. So it's kind of fascinating. Eventually, White drummed up sufficient compensation. It's not always that easy to convert the extra pawn in practice. So this gambit, so eventually that was a draw, is not entirely bad. But with bishop e7, Fischer is definitely getting an advantage now, a really practical situation where there's loads of pressure on the f file and d file at least. d6, and now with this, the centre is dissolving after bishop f4. D takes, queen takes, the queen's come off, okay, but look at this situation now. Yeah, the centre clear of pawns, those two files, and the pressure on the f file in particular could be useful for white. So black castling queenside. It is a pleasant possession to have, perhaps in a Simul, this kind of situation with the queens off, not so complex, but a little bit of persistent pressure out the opening. So rook hf1, that f file to play with immediately is a big danger. You know, rook takes f7, rook takes d8, threatened. So we have bishop e7, getting out of the way of that horrible tactic. Bishop d6, bishop takes, rook takes, bishop g4. And yeah, white was again threatening rook takes f7 with rook d8 mating. I mean, just to show you that. This is a neat tactical idea. So the bishop is actually going to g4. But one problem with this, one slight downside, the rook can make an entry to d7 if the bishop relinquishes d7 control, as it's about to do. So after bishop h5, Fischer must be very happy by now. His three pieces are coordinating very nicely on f7. Rook on the 7 hitting b7. That's protected with tempo. And now a5. So threatening to trap the bishop. a4. Bishop g6. Black's pawns on the queen side are slightly fragile. And that's often a precursor, so snapping up those pawns and getting huge connected pass pawns. So is that going to be the case here? I mean, these pawns are doubled. You might think, oh, it's going to be difficult to use the queen side. But have a look at this. Rook fd1, bishop e4. We have g3. And now bishop f5, which seems a useful fork to get the h3 pawn. But at the cost of this pawn, this majority is growing. Now, after bishop takes, rook takes. And now it's only one pawn on black's queen side. We've got potential c-pawn power. g6, bishop b3, a4, bishop tucks away on a2, bishop g4 hitting the rook, rook d4 hitting the bishop, h5. On bishop f3 here, then there's rook f6. For example, and after bishop g2, rook d7, yes, converging on f7 here with a big advantage. And on bishop e6 there, this is also pleasant enough for white. White's getting a small advantage at least. So h5, and that does suffer a slight issue. The pawn is pinned on f7, so guess what? Weakness of the last move there. White to play, if I give you 5 seconds. Okay, rook takes g6 check, and now rook f6. So white's definitely in the driving seat, and rook's double there against f7. Rook a7, bishop d5, rook e7, and now these pawns are starting to be pushed. So yes, what started to be, what was fragile pawns for black, now this big pass c pawn, and the king comes out for this lovely endgame. Black's really tied down. This is an ideal game for a Simul now. There's not too much counterplay, not too much tactics to calculate. It's really about trying to mobilize these queenside pawns safely. Check, check, and the king comes to the center nicely. And now pushing that pawn. Yes, this pawn is gaining momentum and importance. The king comes to the c5. Yes, and in fact, rook takes a4. So we've got a 3-0 pawn majority. And after rook d6, rook e7, b4, end of game. So, what do we learn from this? These curious trivia, Vienna games. where Fischer's played this weird f4. It's given a name, apparently, the Stanley variation, Bronstein Gambit. So curious. It's not entirely bad, it seems, in practice. Not that easy for black to convert. If black has to play, a move like Queen e7, there's congestion on the king's side to castle that easily. So maybe not an entirely terrible gambit. But according to Chess Tempo, black does do better overall. So it's not the greatest gambit in the world. Possibly on the bottom quarter, I would say, of gambits for soundness. But interesting, use for simuls, for Fischer to transpose into this Vienna game gambit, I thought was quite interesting. But a much safer way of playing the Vienna game is, as this course recommends, Kingscrusher TV/Vienna, you'll see that against either knight c4 or knight f6, you can simply play g3. I have a fabulous game in store for you with David Bronstein with the white pieces coming soon with g3 against Teschner. So that was played in 1965. So look out for that on the Kingscrusher channel as well, for Vienna game with the modest g3, less controversy, less dangers, less drama, and a solid position. So hope you look out for that soon. Okay, check out that course again, Kingscrusher TV/Vienna, in preparation for the David Bronstein game coming up. Thanks very much.